In this sound design tutorial, we take a look at how to create gun sound effects out of ordinary sounds. You will learn how to create this gunshot sound effect with only these recordings. Hi, my name is Simon. On this channel I help you as a beginner sound designer to create unique sound effects so you can stick out from the crowd. Today it's time to make some gunshot sound effects. We will make a hyper-realistic sound effect of an AK-47 with recordings of a snare drum, a door handle and a rake. These are all stuff that can be found around your house, but if you don't have these or you don't want to record them yourself, I have gathered all my recordings and the final design into a folder that I have linked in the description below. So if you want to design gunshot sound effects yourself without the hassle of collecting the props and record them, just download that folder and you can immediately start to design your own gunshot sound effects. When designing sounds like these that are grounded in the real world, it's important to listen to a lot of different sounds like the one that you are about to create and analyze what different ingredients you need to create it. In this case, with the AK-47, I needed a low and thumb sound together with some high and mid mechanical sounds. I also needed all of these props to be playable and performed, because even though there is an expression for sequence sounds that lack variation to have a machine gun-like sound to them, you know, strings can sound mechanical if they don't have enough round robins, for example. It's important to not have all rounds of fire from the AK-47 to sound exactly the same, but more on that later. When you have an idea what ingredients you need, you just start to record the props of them. In my case, I used a snare drum for the main punch, and I thought that with some processing I could get a low and thump out of that too. I found an old broken rake that had an interesting metallic sound to it, but it lacked some rattle and motion that I heard in most references that I listened to. So I tried this doorknob, and layered together I thought the rake and the doorknob could work as the mid and high mechanical layers. I recorded all of these sounds with this Sennheiser MKH416 shotgun mic. I mean, a shotgun mic just felt natural for this purpose in so many ways. This is my go-to mic for almost all spot recordings, but I'm really curious about what mics you are using for your recordings. So let me know your favorite mics for spot recordings in the comments below. I started the design process with a snare drum since that felt like the main layer for this sound. As I said earlier, there is a saying about sequence sounds that don't have enough variations can sound a little bit like a machine gun. So when designing a semi-automatic weapon like this, how do you go about that? Is it more appropriate to have it sound exactly the same for each variation, or with some difference in them? I found a middle way of these two paths to work really well. I let the main layer to have the exact same sound for each variation, but the other mechanical layers to have different sounds for each variation. To me, this sounds both natural and feels logical. The main firing sound doesn't change too much during a firing sequence, but the moving and mechanical parts sound different depending on how the gun is held and how the moving parts is rattled in the sequence. So the snare drum layer sounds like this without any processing. Of course, just like a duplicated snare drum. So I did a little bit of processing to it. I started with some broad stroke shaping of an EQ. I scooped the mids and gave it a little bit of highs. This is the frequency character that I found most of the AK-47 references had that I listened to. I then reduced the transients a little bit with spiffing cut mode. And then I shaped it a little bit more with another EQ just in the mids here. And with that processing, it sounds like this. Now I had a decent main layer that I could use as foundation and build the rest of the sound on. Next I want to add the low end of the sound, and since I want the low end to be really tight together with the rest of the sound, I thought I could create it from the snare drum too. So I routed this snare drum over to this bass track, and here I added Submarine. I set it to 100% wet and I increased the range of it so I get a little bit of low mid frequencies in there. And then I pushed the drive all the way up, and that created this layer. A really tight sub layer. Then I added the rake, and as I said earlier, I used different sounds of this layer for each variation in the firing sequence. I lined it up with the main sound, gave it a little bit of high end with an EQ, and it sounded like this. And together with the base layer and the main layer, it sounds like this. It sounds really cool. The rake layer fill out the high end really nice there, but I still felt I needed some more motion and rattle to finish off the design with. Just as I did with the rake, I used different variation for each sound in the sequence of the door handle. I felt I needed this layer to cut through the mix a bit more, so I ran it through a limiter. And then to complement the other layers and to fit in with the full design, I gave it some mids with an EQ, and it sounded like this. Then I routed both the rake and the doorknob into this reverb track where I added Pro R2. And in order to get the feeling that the sound is really close to us when it's firing, but when it stops we hear the reflections from the surroundings around us, I used the ducking feature in Pro R2 and I filter out the high end. The filtering is because the high end of the sound has less energy and can't travel all the way back to us again after it's been reflected from the surroundings, so the ducking and the filtering together will create a slightly more natural experience of the soundscape. Now we are at the final step of this sound, the mastering chain. But before we dive into that, let's have a listen to all layers together without the mastering chain, and then we take a look at that too. It's okay, but it's a little bit undefined. I wanted some more punch to the mids, so I used the transient shaper spiff for that in parallel mode with just 27% wet. And then I wanted some more glue and some more over-the-top feeling, and I love Shep's parallel particles for that stuff. And then to round it off and just reshape it a little bit and basically give it a little bit more mids, I used the final EQ. And the final result was this. So the raw source recordings sounded like this, and with some processing we turned it into this. As I said earlier, all sounds for this design was recorded with my Sennheiser MKH416 mic, but you can of course use